Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to Ocean Nexus Ocean Equity webinar. This is ninth. Karen, am I correct? Okay, I think I am. But right, and so format is the same. We're gonna have a few presentations and we'll have a Q&A, but during the presentations, you can put the Q&A in Q&A box. If you just go down, you'll see Q&A box and you can just put it in. And if you couldn't really figure out which one is the Q&A box, just put in the chat, put on the chat. And as our speakers talk, that we'll have some supplemental informations in chat, which our organizer, Karina Trudeau, will put it in time to time. So check the chat box as well. Okay, so my name is Yoshitaka Ota. I'm a director of Ocean Nexus. I'm also professor at the University of Rhode Island, Marine Affairs. So this webinar is supported by Nippon Foundation, Ocean Nexus, in collaboration with Nippon Foundation, who wants to believe, who wants to who seeks to build a capacity for the future ocean. And when we talk about the capacity, we're talking about like interdisciplinary, critical perspective, and really looking for oceans to support the people in that community. And that's really the philosophy that we're carrying, and we're going to push it through this. Webinar is picking up topics from our 9 themes. And this time we're looking into the governance, but more specifically on the topic that we are really working on, which is ocean equity. Since the start of Ocean Nexus 2019, we put this mission of centering social equity at the center of ocean governance. But to do so, and then to do so, we built this term called ocean equity. And then many people actually use the term ocean equity or ocean justice here and there. So last 5 years, we have been carrying this one project, which we hope to finish it earlier, but it has been taking quite some time, to really look for, what is the discussion surrounding this idea of equity and justice in the ocean? What are people talking about? And potentially, okay, what can we contribute as an ocean nexus, which will be unique and what we believe as a core? If you know a little bit about ocean nexus, what we are trying to push is really the discussion about the much more critical perspective, which is being anti-racial, being decolonial, and applying feminist and queer approach in ocean governance. And that what we really think is core and foundation of ocean justice and ocean equity. So we call ocean justice, ocean equity as a social justice at the sea. So that's what really the approach that we are going for. But today, I have 2 presenters, Abigail Kim and Brian O'Neill, both introduced themselves. But Abigail has really joined Ocean Nexus, last couple of years and really helping us to complete this 5 years literature review, to really looking into what have we talked and what has been discussed out there for the justice and equity. So she's going to share some of the results. Thank you very much for Abby to join in and complete this project. I really appreciate that. It's been a long journey for us. Brian O'Neill joined Ocean Nexus 3 years ago, and he is critical sociologist and runs a lab with Matthew Schneider, really looking into, okay, when we talk about equity and justice, we need to look at it from very critical perspective, and there has been pedagogy and scholarship in there. Let's bring it into. So that's what Brian is really working on. It's been very enlightening working with or collaborating with a bunch of sociologists through Brian and Matthew and then Tim, who's been our fellow. And I really urge everyone to go and look for Fathom, which is our blog series. You go to our Ocean Nexus web and you can go to Fathom, and there's a bunch of great piece written by Brian and then Matthew and their colleague, fantastic series of sociologists really talking about what do we mean by societal in ocean governance. So today, it's a delightful opportunity. Okay, so first I'm going to pass it to Abby, and then Abby will pass it to Brian. But Abby and Brian, before you give your presentation, please introduce yourself. Okay, because I'm sure you did a better job. So thank you very much for everyone. Thanks, Abby and Brian in advance. Abby, pass it to you.
Sure. Thanks, Yoshi. Hi, everyone. I'm Abigail Kim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm a research assistant at Dalhousie University, and I've been a program officer now for about a year with Ocean Nexus. I use she, her pronouns. And this project, sort of the Spark Notes version of it, is the culmination of a very long literature review and analysis process. It's trying to get at what is the landscape of how we as ocean governance scholars are discussing equity in this space? And more importantly, how has that understanding evolved over time, and what can that mean for how we're applying equity in our work? It's been in part done with Dr. Yoshitaka Ota, who you've just heard from, and Dr. Wilf Schwartz at Dalhousie University, who's also a deputy director at Ocean Nexus. So as evident, if you're sort of working in the ocean space, you know that there's been an overall increase in global policy directives, research projects, and investment initiatives related to social equity. And in tandem with this, we also see published literature in the ocean governance space with increased engagement with equity. And with this, if you've worked with Ocean Nexus, or you've been involved with Ocean Nexus, or you even work in the ocean governance space, you've heard the term equity, and Yoshi has sort of brought that up to begin this discussion. But I think as it pertains to this research, it's really important to understand the basis of how I've approached my conceptualization of equity. So in its most basic form, notions of equity really stem from the legal sphere, traditionally considered a part of sort of a needs-based system of individualized justice from Greek and Roman ideals. However, contemporary uses in the 20th, 21st century have really expanded upon this to draw upon social justice-based movements and theories, thinking critical race theory, health equity, education reform, even environmental justice. And this has really further differentiated it from equality's treat everyone the same rhetoric. And so today, ocean equity to me is really the dismantling of systemic barriers and social power structures that perpetuate discrimination, underrepresentation, marginalization, and underinvestment based on group traits. And I highlight Martha Minnow's work here. She really discusses the protean nature of equity, where in practice, a really oversimplified or attainable version of equity is often disseminated in public policy. And Brian's work also sort of reinforces this sort of lexical ambiguity of ocean equity in practice can perpetuate forms of cooptation. And you can see this sort of in similar notions surrounding the green or blue washing of a blue economy, for example. And this has really led to the crux of this research that's motivated by a concern that without pausing and sort of reflecting upon and critiquing the underlying canons and definitions and themes that shape our discussions of equity across ocean governance literature, these long-standing paradigms that we've held may lead to a harmful dilution of an inherently critical and anti-hegemonic concept, as well as a lack of modernization for our understanding and application of equity. And does this lead us to missing the mark on what global organizations and the scientific community itself are actually calling for? And so to address this, we've really used two methods, a literature review to create sort of that landscape of ocean governance literature that addresses ocean equity, and a citation and network analysis. And I'll start with the literature review, done in part with a previous colleague at Ocean Nexus, and then I've sort of taken it in the last couple years or so. It's a very broad search for any ocean governance article that discusses equity outside of simply just the abstract. And so you can imagine how many papers we received from that search. And in weeding some out due to our selection criteria, we landed on about 301 articles that really make up our primary literature base and really give us that sort of landscape of ocean equity. So if we look at that sort of broad picture, we see this continual increase in ocean governance articles that engage with equity. We see sort of a spike here in 2006, more action from 2014 to 16, and then a big spike in 2018 and a continual increase. If we look at thematically those ocean governance papers that address equity, we see that the overwhelming majority is on fisheries, so about 31%, which is the majority in this case, followed by those that are on marine protected areas. And this here is articles on the governance and research directives that we see and commentary on that per se. We know that most articles that engage with equity do not define it. So that's about 78% of those articles that mention equity don't actually provide a definition. Prior to 2016, only 7 ocean governance articles that discussed equity actually defined it. And we're seeing an increase moving into the 2020s. And those that do, that 22%, often contextualize it as a process of recognition, procedure, and distributional equity, or it's equated to fairness and justice as an outcome per se, or it's really emphasized the rights and needs of marginalized actors. So with that sort of landscape in mind, we really want to move into now, where has this understanding come from and what insights can that tell us? And so that's led us to a citation network analysis. In short, it's a very applied process, but in short, it's really reading these 301 articles and asking myself 2 questions. Does this source define equity, and what does it cite? And so we weeded out the articles that didn't define equity, and that sort of left us with the first tier of this analysis. And so we would read that, find out what sources it cites, and that created a second tier, and so on and so forth until we had no new sources come out, and that was around tier 6. And I say sources, and we have 172 of them in this network, because they range in different types of publications. We have books, dictionaries, web pages even, reports and policies, etc. And those are all connected by 191 citation relationships. And when we visualize that, I'll show you now, it looks a little something like this. Here we go. So when you look at a traditional citation network analysis, you can often see it in a circle with those connections in between. But I found for the purpose of this research, it was really helpful to imagine it a bit like a family tree. And so up here, we have this first tier of ocean governance articles. And if per se we wanted to track the definition or conceptualization of equity, we could do so by tracing these connections. So for example, I'll just jump to the first one we have here. This is Loomis and Ditton in 1993. And if per se we wanted to track where they immediately pulled their definition of equity from, we could do so in the second tier. And where do they pull their definition of equity from, and so on and so forth. And the network also is organized by topic, and so we can see sort of clustering of topics. We have the sort of psychology, sociology group over here. We have the energy group over here. We also see clustering of these citation network links, which is really interesting. It's these darker shades of black that when you zoom in, show quite a few links to particular publications, and that'll tell us what are the most popular and influential in the network, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. But as I move into these findings, this is really what I'm pulling from, as well as a sort of more quantitative analysis of the metadata of the articles that we pulled. So I'm going to bring us back to the presentation. Okay, so moving on to sort of what this tells us, what do we get from this citation network analysis? So we know that most ocean governance articles, that tier 1 level, are citing other articles in the ocean governance space. Around 15% of all sources that come from that first tier are ocean governance papers, followed by conservation and then environmental justice. We also know that if we look at across the entire network, so all of those little bubbles in that visualization, that when we weight them based on number of citation links, conservation sources are by far the most influential in shaping narratives of discussions of equity that lead into these ocean governance articles, followed by other ocean governance papers and then papers in the justice space. And I'll describe a little bit why that might be different from the previous graph you just saw. So we know that most items are actually cited just once in that network, sort of as one-offs, or they just weren't used by another source to cite a definition of equity. That was about 51% of papers. But we do know that there are only 6 items that are actually cited over 5 times. However, these 6 items make up a quarter of citation links, which doesn't sound like a lot, but is incredibly significant when you think about how many papers and how many links are in this network. And I'm going to highlight 3 of them here. We have McDermott et al.'s Examining Equity Payment for Ecosystem Services paper, which is by far the most cited in the network, about 16 times, which is about 8% of all links. We have Pascual et al.'s paper on payment for ecosystem services and social equity, which actually cites McDermott's paper. That's cited 10 times and about 5% of all citation links. And then we have the many republications of Rawls' A Theory of Justice, which is cited 8 times and make up about 4% of all citation links. So there are many other analyses, and those will be available in a subsequent report, but these are sort of the main findings of this research. And what that's really led me to think about is, or conclude to, is that we're fishing in a very small and shallow pond. Small being that we're citing very select number of papers and very few papers to inform our understandings of equity in the ocean governance space. And shallow in that we're only citing, or we're typically citing rather, papers within the ocean governance world and marine and terrestrial conservation. We're not typically engaging with works that are firmly rooted in racial justice or feminist theory, for example. And this is not to say that pulling from and commenting on papers like, or books like Rawls, for example, is not important, but as an academic community that is growing and continuing our understanding of equity, it's really important that we further investigate these articles and pull from these articles that are actually critically engaging with these concepts that we're looking to apply. Next is that reflexivity and intentionality is essential. Where we choose to pull our understandings from is important, and it's also important to interrogate our own understandings and biases as we continue to write and research in this space. And lastly, the biggest question that I have, and probably a question that you might have, is then what is missing? How do we make our pond deeper? How do we make our pond bigger? How do we fish from a larger pond? I don't have that answer for you. In this presentation, Brian is going to discuss a little bit about that and some of his thoughts on bringing critical environmental justice into ocean governance and ocean equity. But that is a big question, obviously, that I have following this research. And lastly, what I'll leave you with is that inequities in ocean governance don't exist in a vacuum. They instead reflect systems of intersectionality and subordination and exploitation that are engaged with at a depth required outside of our ocean governance world. And so I'd urge you to be unafraid and unhesitant to fish from a larger pool when you're developing your conceptualizations of equity in future research and future studies in the ocean governance space. And so I'll say thank you so much for your attention and leave you again with a note that a full report on the data and analysis will be published on oceannexus.org very soon as we begin to sort of finalize those figures, etc. And I'll pass it over to Brian, who's going to sort of expand upon some of these findings.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abby. And Karen, I believe you've got my slides, so you can share those. Perfect. Yeah, so thanks everybody for listening, and thanks Abby for setting me up so nicely. So as Yoshi mentioned, I'm Brian O'Neill. I'm at the Evans School. I was trained as a sociologist, and I've been a Nexus Fellow for the past couple of years. And I also direct with my colleague Matt Schneider at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, the Sustainability Equity Action Lab, where we work on a lot of these same things, specifically from kind of an environmental sociological angle. And so in line with that, the last decade of research that I've done about the energy transition and climate adaptation more generally has started to get into these issues about justice and equity that Abby was mentioning. And so I've done work from Pennsylvania to Arizona to California, North Carolina, and in France, conducting hundreds of interviews with stakeholders from all walks of life, and that's a lot of what is informing, my presentation today. Two of the big projects that we've been working on, one has been about ocean desalination, turning the ocean into drinking water. The other one about offshore wind energy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so rather than a standard kind of empirical presentation, this is going to be a broader kind of zoomed out, if you will, conceptual and critical view. And so the underlying question here, I think, that Abby's getting at and that I want to kind of highlight is, what is the problem with our ocean discourse today? And then furthermore, and the thing I hope that you'll be able to take away from this is, what are the thinking tools that ocean equity and justice as concepts are doing for us? Or if you want, what are they sensitizing us? And so I'll try and keep this brief. And so we can go to slide 1, Karen. Thank you very much. So to take an example that I feel like the audience probably knows pretty well, we can look at the UN. All right, so we have the UN Ocean Congress coming up in early June, for example. So I thought this was kind of apt. So they define, if you look up ocean equity at the UN, they mention things like a sustainable ocean economy puts people at its center, works for everyone, enables human rights, facilitates the equitable distribution of ocean wealth, and ensures equality of opportunity for all. So while this seems nice, I would offer to you that this framing demands critique. It demands problematization. So let me be clear here. I think that the UN and I share something. We want equity to be at the forefront of our policymaking, right? The problem, though, as Abby started to explore, is how and why the notion might be deployed. We should remember that our concepts are consequential because they shape, how we think and act in the world. And so, part of our work has been trying to uncover what is this intellectual history here with these kinds of terms, and why are they missing the mark? And I implore you, to see these kinds of issues not as kind of immaterial or silly or whatever, or to say that these definitions are intentionally broad. We need to compromise. We need to bring familiar policy discourses together. If that's the case, I think we don't need it, and the UN should work on defining something else. But their attention to it, I think, signals to me that there is something radical in this idea about ocean equity that they want to get under control, and I don't think that's the point. We can go to the next slide. So the point here is, equal opportunity, equitable distribution, working for everyone. This is all about fairness. This is the stuff coming from Rawls, for example, that Abby was mentioning. But the problem is things are not fair, right? And so here I think of my interlocutor from my fieldwork, Oscar, in California, who I worked with about desalination. And what Oscar spoke to me about as we would walk through his neighborhood, a kind of prototypical place of environmental injustice with a history of industrial activities and pollution, and extended families living, together to afford uncontrollable rent. What he said always stayed with me. And it was, we need to rethink, right? That's the important part. We need to rethink the way that we advocate. The problem I see here is that you have a big company sending people into a community saying this was an environmental justice. In that case, the desalination project. You have investors and coming in with their money trying to persuade a community. In this particular case, he says the Latino community, that water is needed, and that we're in a drought, we're needing water, etc. But they're using this to push their agenda and their advantage. Oscar is making a point about these situations that arise where there are crises, right? Where actors see a profit. If there is opportunity in the world, it too often appears for those already with plenty of it. Further, he points out how crises can create situations where the very terms of debate, like justice or equity, become politicized, right? And this is why we can't take them for granted. Oscar never placed action above thinking. He often related to me how he felt a realization, a discovering environmental justice was a thing as a first-generation college student. It was something that was impacting his life, but he didn't have a vocabulary for it, and this empowered him when he was able to learn about it. And so reflection then became a key thing, and so did critique. So our policies are not and for him were not for all. They were for poor working class Latinos living on the coast of California. And lately, he's been running for political office. We can go to the next slide, Karen. Thank you. So what would the coordinates of this critique be? As Yoshi mentioned, these would be anti-racist, or a critique of white privilege, anti-subordination, or a critique of domination, decolonial, a critique of hegemony. Critique here means sensitivity to power, right? Sensitivity to how groups are not treated as equals, sensitivity to an encroachment of authoritarian practices against democratic principles and public debate. These are the coordinates of a starting point for critique in our approach. We need to pay attention, I think, here to what I call cooptation and constituent processes of washing. These are things that we've seen repeatedly now across a variety of sectors in our work with the C-Lab. You're probably familiar with washing. This is a tool here where you're labeling things about your carbon emissions or a fair trade or whatever. The analytical notion of washing identifies a discursive deception by a powerful actor, often promoting some kind of consumption, and that there's some ethical underlying production process for tuna, chocolate, coffee, etc. What I've observed, though, and what Oscar was getting at here was that this other kind of issue, I think, about a social structural deception or maneuvering, this is cooptation, a historical process that involves elites identifying the risk of being challenged, right, resulting in the use of tactics to absorb, agglomerate distant groups to legitimize their agendas, elite agendas. So as a neat definition, cooptation is the process of this absorption of new elements or leadership or policy determining structure, taking those things into an organization or an institution as a means of averting threats to the status quo existence. And so these are a couple of things and hopefully analytical terms that I think that we need to push forward if we want to avoid the basically, dilution of critical notions. We can go to the last slide. So what is the pathway, right? This is always a question that I receive from people. And so I'll leave you then with what I think is a first node, if we're going to stay with the network theme, in a larger constellation of solutions at the level of solving how we engage with lived reality. Particularly, I like this metaphorical explanation given by Allan Sekula, a social theorist and photographer who wrote the following after swimming around Bill Gates's house near Seattle, I should say, more than 20 years ago. He writes, "In an age that denies the very existence of society, to insist on the scandal of the world's increasingly grotesque connectedness, the hidden, merciless grinding away beneath the slick, superficial liquidity of markets, is akin to putting oneself in the position of the ocean swimmer, timing one's strokes to the swell, turning one's submerged ear with every breath to the deep rumble of stones rolling on the bottom far below. To insist on the social is to practice purposeful immersion." And so these words, I think, are radically apposite for a moment of artificial intelligence and other technological optimisms. And I hope that this is a point that can inspire your own work as it does ours as we engage with people at sea and on our coast, etc. I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, both of you. Would you just unmute your microphone? Because I want to have a little bit of chat and then we move to the questions. So far in the Q&A, there's a admiration and to congratulate Abby's presentation from anonymous attendees. But yeah, I think it was a great job. So, it's as an anthropologist, I started working with when I, realized the issue of equity, which really at the beginning, it wasn't really so much about the equity. What we found in our previous, work was there's a bunch of scientific results that came up and it's saying okay, the ecosystem and the environment of the ocean is shifting because of the climate change largely. And some other things which kind of accumulate and bring really unpredictable, non-linear pattern of the change. So that's one side of it. And the other side was, okay, there's the people trying to manage the change and the people trying to sort of manage even non-change, kind of like a overexploited ocean, and really to just bring conservation or harvest management, just to make sure that nature will stay, as closer to the pristine. So, we can actually keep it sustainable. And then sometimes they actually frame it like sustainable as in that we have to pass it to the generations. You hear in 2010 or 11 we hear generation after generations and then all that time. So but the question really was the connection between those environmental change and this inequality and disparity, and it's really not because of the linear situation, because pie gets smaller and people will suffer more, but it was because of our intention is not really to change the current system, which actually, not about the distribution, but really do not push those injustice, do not point out fingers to those inequities. That was really the huge problem that I actually faced when I look at ocean equity or social equity right at the beginning, because it was always equitable approach, fair approach. And then it didn't look at me like any strategic approach to the actual problem. So that's why I ask, thank you for the Katie Sheldy, Kate Crossmans to start the project. I'm looking at the review, and then, ask Abby to carry on doing this. Abby, but the people can ask also, but at least we're going right direction. And I just want to ask both of you, we're going right direction. Maybe it's not perfect, but we are trying to just find the framework or indicators to really see our progress. It's good to talk about the anti-white supremacy. It's good to talk about decolonization, but we need a clear indicator, and we also wanted to make a progress, at least in a realistic manner. When you're reading those 300 papers, okay, do you actually see this dilemma? We have what we can do, and that doesn't really include those uncomfortable conversations. What do you think? Too tough.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. What I found in reading 301 papers on this topic is really that we've found a definition that feels comfortable, and one that we can sort of plug and play depending on if we're informing policy, if we're doing a case study. But what I mentioned in my presentation, what I think is really important, is that we don't stop there. Because if not, we know that with definitions of frameworks or proposals of concepts, I like to think of the blue economy, for example, had a very clear purpose and definition to begin with, and has slowly become something different through various versions of research and government policies. You sort of see this slipping away from the original intent. I think that without research like this, and without continually sort of pushing ourselves to think about what are the inequities that we are trying to face here, and that our research addresses, without continuing to push that boundary, again, we're at risk of slipping back a bit and falling into that lexical ambiguity, or that protean nature, in which it's really accessible, and we feel really great that we're working on these projects that have a very clear definition of equity. But equity, as we understood it in the time of Rawls, per se, is not the same inequities that folks face today, or are different versions, or are more intensified versions, rights under attack, et cetera, et cetera. They're very different with the similar core values. And so we can comment on those past pieces, but still encourage ourselves and others in this network to continue to push to create understandings and develop understandings of equity that better reflect those inequities that folks are facing.
Hey, Abby, I have a question. Can I jump in, Yoshi?
Yeah.
So about that exact thing, and so Abby, for the listeners, shared with me, her paper and stuff. So I've also read it. But in terms of what you just mentioned, Abby, like the, citing the papers, building on the papers, you've actually read a lot of these papers, right? What was the level of engagement there in terms of with these different concepts of equity?
Yeah, yeah. At the base level of engagement with equity, a majority of papers simply mention it between 1 to 3 times. And there are very few that actually really either devote a clear subsection or critically engage with articles outside of the ocean governance space. So it's incredibly limited, unfortunately. But I think a lot of that is to do with folks maybe don't know where to look or don't know what's missing, or it's simply this is the most attainable version of equity that they have in front of them. But yes, the engagement with and with a depth with other literature is very limited.
Brian, I mean, one of the so like astonishing, the encounter that I had with some of the papers which are more cited, like a McDonald's one and then others. And this really is what it is, not critical engine, but I mean, they really start their definitions with Oxford English Dictionary. And then that's in the paper. And then when I look at it, it says OED. And I was like, okay, what is OED? What is OED? And then I was just looking into it and I saw this Oxford English Dictionary. I was like, hang on, is that really the beginning of the definition? And then yes, it moves to the few literatures, but basically, well, it's not. It's all of them really goes off to Rawls and Schneider a bit, and one came with Amartya Sen. That's pretty much it, right? Do they actually include any of much more recent sociological understanding of it, or political science of it, or philosophy even? No, really, I didn't see any papers in it.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't I don't know if I think maybe knowing Abby and Yoshi a little bit that you might agree with me, but isn't this kind of, people always want practical things? Here's a thing at a practical level that that we all can do is actually engage with these pieces, right? Read them, understand them within some kind of theoretical apparatus instead of just this kind of cynical level of citation, right? And this is going to pay benefits in the future in terms of, when you're engaging with policymakers, because you have empirical examples, you have a theoretical conceptual apparatus to be able to push for things that will be actually just and equitable.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, Abby, what, so, when you look at those papers, the risk and the fear that I had was, there's nothing we say we're supposed to do is in here, like academically. So we talk about like, okay, there's an environmental justice issue with the ethnic group and the racialization, but there's nothing about that. There's a concern about indigenous knowledge and we need to be inclusive, but there's nothing about that. There's a concern about like global south and the issue of the power and subordination, but there's nothing about that. So I was like, while you mentioning those are important topics, in your definition and the discussion, there's just nothing about that, but it's being written in everywhere. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's a cycle we get into, and the whole point of the scientific publication process and engaging with other scientists is to understand what their findings were and what they say future research should do, and then act upon it and continue to expand and broaden and narrow as we see fit. I will say that there's a common theme in these papers that at the end in the last sentence of the discussion is always, we need to engage with critical literature in this, or we need to bring in these concepts. And I read that and I think, wonderful, we're thinking about these things. And then I read the sort of next generation of papers and it's the same thing. And then it's the same thing. And I don't think there is going to be like a huge event that we're like, okay, now is the time that we're actually going to do it. I think the time is now to do it. I mean, we've been calling for it for so long. And it's really up to us as scholars, and if we're going to continue to write on these topics, that we do engage with literature that is outside of what is currently being cited, and those pieces that are taking the time to engage critically with simply just equity, potentially in the space around race or gender, and then bring that in. How does that apply to our work in ocean governance? Because it's a cycle that has continued, and if we think it's going to stop, I can tell you by looking at papers from the 1970s to 2024 that it hasn't. And so yes, again, the time is now to really expand those horizons and actually address those critical concepts.
I mean, Brian, I mean, as a sociologist, when you look at those, and then I'm just going to your colleagues as well, and then you feel like, oh my God, there's tons of work we've been doing, right? And like, why you not even looking at it, So there must be a frustration, but at the same time, I really want to ask you, where do you think this came from? Is it some kind of like a very insular way of developing this, or this just some of the people just let them get away with it? If I write the paper about the modeling, I don't think I'm going to pass any peer review, but the equity they get, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Where do you think is that come from? What's your frustration?
Yeah. Well, this is something that other social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, human geographers will be familiar with. That it's often uh, it's often okay, for and socially acceptable for people with training in natural sciences, biological sciences, physical sciences to then say, "Oh, I've discovered that the social world is important and that there's inequalities. I want to now be in social science, right? But not the other way around." There's something analogous there to that that you're talking about. But furthermore, Abby's point for her paper and the way that she was talking about today was especially interesting to me because she identifies a few key themes, right? The conservation literature. I've got the ecosystem services, right? These kind of things, which are all kind of rooted in a lot of of natural resource economics, for example, right? So you're starting to get the coordinates of where these types of ideas are coming from, but then these literatures also a larger critique of them has been lack of engagement with the work in race and racism, etc., colonialism, global unequal exchanges, the whole history of the last 40 years of sociology of development work, with excellent ethnographies of the World Bank, and the UN, etc. Um, because and just to kind of put a point in this, I think sometimes when I've talked to people in the field of conservation work, it's frustrating because it seems like some of these social categories, gender, race, class, are things to be discovered, right, in reality. And my point is kind of in brief, we need to not treat it that way. We need to go into the field, we need to go into our projects with this theoretical information about where and why these kind of things might be happening, to then be able to reformulate later through the field work, through our engagement with communities, why these things are happening the way that they are, why dispossession is taking the specific form that it is. But we absolutely have to have a wider apparatus at our disposal going into the field, because otherwise we're going to be constantly rediscovering these inequalities and getting we're be on this hamster wheel.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways a bit, Brian, when we have this conversation and we talk about like specific things that you talk about, equity is really not equality, that's really important.
Yeah.
And it's not about like a fairness to treat everybody the same, really. But then there will be some other people will say like, look, Yosh, you put anti-racist, you put the feminist and all that, right? But the equity and the justice can also be multi-perspective. There's like your set of the equity definition, my set of the equity definition, their, all right? So their set of equity definition, and our set of the equity definition. So why can't we have a multiple ones? Why does it have to be specifically often connected with something we don't really always have to talk about, like race or the patriarchy, or history of colonialism, or continuous history of decolonization. Why can we be multiple? Isn't that much more so embracing and inclusive? It sounds a little bit, even being very cynical, then it sounds like a Black Lives Matter versus All Life Matters. Going too far? But yeah, what do you guys think?
Um, I think you made a good point there that we're a lot of the time, and Brian mentioned this as well, we're hoping to get to a similar space where we deny subordination, we deny racism, we deny patriarchy, these really core values. But I think when we move to an area where our definitions are so broad or too close to equity or equality rather, or are talking about fairness when we're not talking about fair for who and who decides what fair, and those critical nuanced pieces that can seem cynical at the time, we start to, and I'll use the UN's sort of wording here, we start to leave people behind. If we're thinking about equity for all, well, who does that all encompass? And if we don't discuss those who are disproportionately impacted by the outcomes of ocean governance per se, if we don't talk about folks who are historically marginalized, are they really part of that all that we're talking about when we think equity and ocean governance for all? And so, yeah, there are spaces for different interpretations of equity when it comes to health equity, gender equity. Of course, these are going to look different. But I think if we continue to let these definitions sort of broaden out for the sake of usefulness and applicability and fast applicability, then we lose the point of leaving no one behind as we attempt to reach an equitable ocean governance system.
Nice, Brian.
Yeah. To build on that, Abby, I think you're exactly right. And so to again give another practical example for people to potentially pick up and refer to. One, as we've been getting into this work with the ocean, with Yoshi, with the Ocean Nexus, with the Sea Lab, a key work for me was Michael Goldman's work from the early 2000s. His book is called Imperial Nature, and he has an article that's called How Water for All Became Hegemonic. This was a multi-year ethnography that he did with people at the World Bank. So here again, we have a historical example of a for all concept, right? And what have we seen in the last 20 years? That we see increasing encroachment in terms of privatization, inequality in water access, all these kind of things that this for all concept was supposed to eliminate, right? But what he points to is that there are processes of discourse and consensus building, right, that sort of invite a certain minimum level of discussion, right, but then ultimately aim to push it away, right? And so in a way, we need to singularize. I almost want to say maybe this is what we need to do. We need to be kind of dogmatic about it and say we need to singularize our notion of equity, right? It is about the dispossessed. We're prioritizing marginalized communities. That's it.
Thank you, Brian. I completely agree with you. And Abby, nice point. I mean, in some ways, you both you're both pointing, okay, ultimately, the equity must challenge, kind of like make sure those injustice or people in the power who's actually pushing into those, the burden to the people and feel they are challenged. I think that's extremely important. And then for that, we need to have even dogmatic approach. But then I don't really think it's a dogmatic at all. And then that comes to the question from Will. Will, you asking, well, coming, thank you very much, you're a graduate. So he's asking, it's got like a long explanation, so I'll just leave it, Will, people can read it. But you're asking, so what level of the action is most efficient? What level is and so here the what do you guys think about it? What level? For me, it's usually coming into sort of like three things. One, disrupt or discredit disruptive narrative. Okay, so this is what we're doing, right? Equity is not fairness or equality. Just discredit it. And protect everyone basically means, don't believe law actually protect the people who are marginalized and subordinate, because they usually don't. Well, not usually, they often don't. And then third one is really to consider dignity of the people, which basically means those aggregated data or typical approach doesn't really work for the people who are actually being pushed around. So for me, those are three things. And at any level, I think it is what we need to do. So any level, from national to the regional to the community, and many policy like resources and the tools can actually fit into the places and how it works. So that's my approach. But Ryan, Abby, what do you guys think? What are the levels? And Abby, what kind of levels of the interventions they say they would do? What from the readings you had? Was it mostly like community level of the marine protected area or fisheries approach?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very fisheries based as you saw in those results. It's very outcomes based, which I mentioned briefly about outcomes based justice and fairness. It really comes down to like catch quota and payment for ecosystem services and those pieces that like once harm has already been done or once folks are already marginalized, well, we're providing you with this quota, we're providing you with X, Y, and Z. And as you were talking, I was writing down that a lot of these systems like move very quickly. Policy can move quickly, it can move incredibly slowly, but changes in fishery systems can move very quickly, that we can sometimes forget to think quote unquote radically. But I also don't think it's entirely radical to, for lack of better words, place the rejection of colonial systems, for example, above efficiency. And that ruffles some feathers, and I understand. But if we don't continue to think about, okay, what might a fishery system look like that places reconciliation before efficiency, then again, we lead ourselves down this road of perpetuating systems of harm and subordination and colonialism. Yeah, I've been thinking about that question a lot because there is that quote unquote balance between practicality and what is going to fit with policy. But at the same time, these systems of policy are inherently racist, they're inherently colonial. And so what might that look like to envision a system that isn't and can work towards equity from base up and not just sort of at the outcome level? Brian?
Yeah, and if I kind of am trying to read in between the lines of this, question that was posed to us, maybe there's something there that this person is getting at about the importance of jurisdictions and how state institutions and to some extent private sector actors and philanthropically funded organizations want to be working in specific jurisdictions, and they have, you have your own reasons for doing that. But also for those practitioners, realize that, I don't know, give yourself some credit or realize that you as a person in the social world are traversing multiple levels of action through the people that you meet, through the practices that you engage in, right? It's not just, I need to focus on whatever mid-level state actors or or whatever else it might be, right? So you don't need to erect these kind of boundaries necessarily either. But furthermore, I think there is a place for a kind of division of labor here in terms of there are people who are specialized in policy analysis, which is all about getting at certain jurisdictions and how to intervene in there. But we also need to realize that there's a place for scholarship and critical reflection and these kind of things that can be brought into these, and there can be cross-pollination across these different ways of attacking some of these same problems that we are trying to address and think about. Because, and especially from my view as a scholar, as an academic, what my responsibility is to society is to try and pose the quote unquote right questions. All right.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, honestly, yes, it's really important to think about this complexity and fluidity of the ocean. Jurisdiction is merged and gray, and very difficult to get like the entire heterogeneity of the communities. Different gear use of the fishery communities are divided, all sorts of things, and people tend to use this word nuanced. But when you look at injustice, inequity actually happening in many places, they're very simple. They're never nuanced. They'll never ask nuanced details. Honestly, really, it's just really simple. For instance, I read recently the UK government asked the UK fishermen to lose weight because of the safety issue to engage with the small-scale fisheries. I mean, who does that? Do you see what I mean? And it's a very simple notion that the simple examples such as this, but really even to the large one, if you go to, let's say, the ocean meetings internationally, who do you see? Right? If you just see the panel, who's speaking? What are spoken? It's really straightforward. So I don't really think this nuance thing is real. It's just an excuse. But anyway, so we got 3 minutes. Brent, Abby, can you actually check the chat or Q&A? I don't think there is anything. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
If anybody
I
wants
think,
question, and
did we answer the question above Will's question?
yes, we did.
Fantastic. Then yeah, we are.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And so we're going to continue this conversation. And Abby, thank you very much for completing this. We're going to get to the report and hopefully to publish articles. And we just also wanted to give you guys who's reader audience a little heads up. Brian, I'm going to put you in a spot. You are cooking something for us. Can you just advertise it a little bit?
Sure. So we are currently developing with my co-editors a book project, which we have tentatively titled "A Field Guide to Ocean Equity and Justice," which is going to go under review at a university press this summer. And it's going to be about a lot of these similar things that we've been, exactly these things, I should say, that we've been talking about. Specifically, our goal was to provide a framework to be able to name, identify injustices, and through a series of concrete case studies with human stories, human narratives kind of told in this narrative way, so that it'll be very engaging for you to use in classes, for the general public to read, and very kind of short text as well. 2,000, 3,000 words is our goal. So we're currently in the process of receiving those submissions, and that's an exciting project that we've been able to work on thanks to Yoshi and my co-editors, Christine Knott, Eliana Ritz, Cinda Scott, Matt Schneider, and Tim Clark. So that'll be coming to you. And what are you saying, Yoshi? We're going to maybe have a webinar when that comes out in the future?
Yeah, so with that book, I also want to urge the people listening to this, can you please, because this conversation, critical ocean equity conversation, as Abby proved, is not mainstream. I need you guys to have more people coming to the webinar. I'm seriously asking you guys to just disseminate, get the people, talk about it, get your friends, right? And then all that. Okay, you might not really like what I'm saying, but if you believe this conversation is needed, then please invite people, because we really wanted to have more people to engage with this conversation. Okay, and that will be the really good start. So next month, we're gonna have Dr. Amelia Moore, and we're gonna talk about positionality, right? So if you're gonna talk about equity, if you're gonna talk about the critical, okay, we're gonna talk about ourselves, right? What's the point of it? How are we doing it? How we can develop those conversations about positionality, which is a bit weird terms, to be quite honest for me, but it's really important conversations. We're gonna have a Dr. Amelia Moore, coming in and have a discussion with me about this. So please look for the emails for the invitation, disseminate as much as you can, and let's really keep talking about this. Okay. Thank you very much again for Brian, Abby, and Karen, and I gotta say, Kate Crossman and Katie Shelby and Leah Half, who actually helped in Abby's project early on. And I also thank Matt Schneider, who's been kindly supporting Brian as a friend. Is that okay to say that? As a co-director?
Yeah, of course, and a colleague in the Ocean Nexus. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for everyone, and see you next month.